everyone. So I'm just gonna launch into one of my rambles. This isn't gonna be like a very put together video. This is actually just more for my own reference and something that I thought you guys might find interesting. So right now I'm writing a research proposal based on the Nearest Type Explorer, which is an expansion of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And so what I'm looking at in this particular article that I'm analyzing is the relationship between personality preferences, particularly the MBTI, because there's not much research into the Nearest Type Explorer as it's relatively new. So what I'm going to do is I've highlighted some portions and I'm just going to read them and talk about what they mean or could mean. And then later on, I will do a more put together video about MBTI, mental health, stress, coping, and then also physical ailments, which I did not know were correlated at the very least with personality type. So I'm just going to go through. I could not find a way to make it so that my hand would not be in the video, so I apologize if that bothers anyone. I'm just going to go through, read it, talk about what it means, and then hopefully that'll help me figure out in my literature review portion of my research proposal what portions I want to use. So let's just get started. So the first quote that I highlighted was, "A number of variables were found to have significant correlations with physical disorders. Findings indicated that a preference for introversion, thinking, and judging were found to be significantly related to a higher number of reported problems, and that preferences for IT type and judging types may result in low levels of adaptability to stress, leading to higher levels of illness." So this is Dana Grisby's thesis from 2000 at the University of Houston Clear Lake. I'm going to cite it in APA format in the description. However, I'm not sure how accessible this is to people outside of the UH system because it's through the thesis directory. So in this particular portion, she is referencing the Miller and Cooley study from 1981. And so basically what it's saying there is that if you're introverted, thinking, or judging, especially if you're ITJ, that you're more likely to have higher, not necessarily higher levels of stress, but less adaptability than, for example, feelers or perceivers or extroverts. And not to like bury the lead or anything, but this is something that's seen across studies, especially the introversion extroversion portion, and I believe the judging perceiving portion, if I'm not mistaken. So introversion specifically in this next quote was related to social stress, and thinking was associated with type A behavior, which would both indicate lack of adaptability to stress. And it says that the EI scale was the best predictor of stress and coping skills, and the only MBTI scale to be related to perceptions of stress, while the other MBTI scales tended to be associated with coping processes rather than stress. And this was from the Short and Grasha 1995 study. Yeah, so it looks like introversion, extroversion, very correlated, and we'll see that later on as we're going through. Another one that I thought was interesting, especially for, I'm not sure which all types are introverted feeling dominant, but a Hammer study in 1991 found that dominant introverted feeling is associated with lower coping resources. We'll see a lot of INFPs showing up in the data later on with having lower coping resources, having more anger, having higher levels of depression, stuff like that. So that's something to be aware of if you're an INFP. Also, if you're an ISFP, you're also dominant introverted feeling, and ISFPs have also been shown to have lower levels of positive coping, which we'll talk about later. So the next quote I have is Stevens' 1994 study, and this is still in Grisby. This is in her literature review. This is just who she cited for this information. Well, she, they, he, I don't know their pronouns. So Stevens conducted a study of MBTI preferences and their relationship to coping effectiveness. Her findings provided information about unique coping strategies which were utilized by different psychological types. She found that intuitive and perceiving types tended to use distancing to minimize significant problems. Thinking types used planful problem solving, and perceiving types tended to be more confrontive and aggressive than judging types. She also reported that ENs, so extroverted intuitives, were more optimistic than were introverted intuitives. So basically what's that saying is that coping strategies are different among different preferences, and that I found the perceiving types being more aggressive than judging types and more confrontative to be an interesting report. And also as an ENFP, so an extroverted intuitive, I found it interesting that introverted intuitives are more are less optimistic. I wasn't entirely aware of that, and that seems to be a theme, especially with the higher levels of depression that's later talked about. So they also talked about how in many studies where coping effectiveness has been analyzed, assertiveness has been identified as a characteristic of effective coping. It's important to note that the Narrows Type Explorer, which is what you would have taken if you went to 16personalities.com, and I will link it below, they have an assertive versus turbulent preference now in, I don't know if now is accurate, but that is what they've added to the Myers-Briggs, as well as other theoretical differences that I didn't find much information on. But so in the Williams and Bicknell-Bear 1992 study, they studied the relationship of type and assertiveness, and they found that extroverts were more assertive than introverts, and that intuitive and thinking types reported higher levels of assertiveness than did sensing and feeling types. And so they have a list of, I think, the 4 top assertive types and the 4 bottom assertive types, which I think is interesting because they're doing it by type, whereas the Narrows Type Explorer, when they measure assertiveness versus turbulence, it's in addition to the 4 letters. So the 4 top assertive ones in this study were ENTJs, ENTPs, ENFJs, and ESTPs, which, okay, cool. So, but the thing is even though they're most assertive type, because the Narrows Type Explorer has the assertive versus turbulent preference, it would be interesting to see what percentage of these types are assertive versus turbulent on their scale. And then the lowest in assertiveness were ISFPs, ISFJs, INFPs, and ISTPs. So it's fairly clear that it's extroverts way more assertive than introverts. However, that is based off of whatever scales they were using. So when I go and I research, and if we talk specifically about assertiveness, I'm going to go back to that Williams and Bicknell-Bear study, and I'm going to look at what scales they were using to measure assertiveness, because the definition of assertiveness in relation to the study is very, very important to understanding this information. So when I'm looking at this, for example, for my research, I'm not going to use this without noting that it depends on how you define assertiveness. And I know that in the Nares Type Explorer, assertiveness is correlated with like confidence, lower levels of worry, caring less about perfection, stuff like that. Whereas turbulence is really like perfectionist behavior, over exerting, excessive worry, stuff like that. So it would be interesting to see what those scales are. And when I do a video on assertiveness and personality type, I will go into that study and look at what the scales are. Let's go to the next highlight. Sorry, I forgot to go highlight by highlight. So if I go here, I wanted to, okay, so I'm going through the different coping styles, and this is what Dana Grisby used when they were evaluating coping style and type. And so basically, there are 8 types of coping styles, and there are 4 positive coping styles and 4 negative coping styles. So in the negative coping styles, we've got denial, which is refusal to admit the truth, avoidance, which is like tendency to wait, postpone action, refrain from action, and then there's defensive, which is, defending or protecting with the goal to drive away attack or danger, and it implies the person feels a threat. And then the last negative one is withdrawal, which is like when people move away from other people or situations in order to cope with whatever the stress or the threat is that they're feeling. And so then the positive coping styles would be self-care. So this would be regular practices or habits that take care of the body, such as, proper nutrition, exercise, sleep, and hygiene. Support seeking, which is asking for help and sharing needs, thoughts, and feelings. Behaviors that demonstrate facing demands directly and taking action would be direct action. And then adaptable would be behavior that changes according to changing circumstances. So it would be the ability to change quickly toward the situation. And so with these coping styles, we're going to go through what the research is and what results they found. And so what I would like to do in the future is discuss what coping styles people use depending upon their personality type based on the research, and then discuss ways to increase utilization of positive coping styles. So that'll be something in the future that I will talk about and research. In the research, they were saying that types that scored high on positive styles and low on negative styles might be considered to demonstrate more effective coping. So the MBTI types that had the the best coping, quote unquote, the more positive and the least negative were INTJs and ENFJs. And then the ones that scored low on positive and high on negative, so maybe not the best coping mechanisms, were ISFJ and ESFP. And so another thing that was interesting was stress symptomology, and I can't, so there were, so area 1 of stress is muscular symptomology, area 2 is thinking symptomology, area 3 is behavior symptomology, area 4 is sleep, 5 is circulatory and respiratory symptoms, area 6 is immune symptoms, area 7 is gastrointestinal symptoms, area 8 is psychological, area 9 is gender specific to those with uteruses, and gender specific to those with penises, basically. And so one interesting finding that I highlighted, which I found was interesting, which is that the ISFJ type and the ENFP type were the highest in area 3 responses. So that would be behavioral responses to stress, which the researcher Dana Grisby says could imply that the types of ISFJ and ENFP are at greatest risk for developing stress symptoms. And what I find interesting about this, you'll see later, is that ENFPs actually have a high level of positive coping resources. So it's interesting that ENFPs have high levels of coping resources, yet experience high levels of stress symptomology, which I'd like to do more research into as well. So another thing that they found was that sensors have a more difficult time coping because the activity is vague, ever-changing, lacks clear parameters and clear cause and effect relationships. And it's also speculated that feelers may be less effective at utilizing positive coping styles due to their primary orientation toward other people, their external focus, and their decision orientation toward the welfare of others. This could put them at risk for placing their own needs last, demonstrating greater use of negative coping styles, which reduce action and deny personal need. So when I do the video on, for example, ISFPs who particularly struggle with coping resources and positive coping, we could talk about how sensors have a little bit of a difficulty not understanding coping, but putting it into place because of how ambiguous it is and how difficult it is to know how you're going to feel in a certain situation, how the cause and effect works, you know, which coping to use in which situation, and the sort of freeze response that happens there. And then when we're talking feelers, that's also ISFP. So we could continue to talk about ISFPs, for example, and talk about how they might be more likely to use negative coping styles in response to themselves because they're putting others first and then needing to, for example, withdraw. What's interesting specifically with ISFPs, which part of the reason I'm paying attention is because my girlfriend's an ISFP, but what I noticed about that is with the negative coping styles, they were actually the least likely to use avoidance. I think it more often is withdrawal. But it's also really hard to get high levels of ISFPs. So when we're looking at the data, I'm really going into the ISFP portion. The ISFPs were the smallest group in this study. So the data might not be as reliable. So if we look at types that scored highest in the maximum level of positive coping, those were ENFJs, INFJs, ESTPs, and then ISFPs, ESFPs, and ISTJs scored less frequently in maximum range. Okay, let's go to the next one. So the research shows that sensors were highest scoring in stress symptomology, and intuitives were lowest scoring in stress symptomology. Overall, not in specific, like intuitives, for example, ENFPs are second highest in behavior area of stress symptomology, but overall, considering all of the different symptoms, all of those different 9 areas, sensors scored the highest. Yeah, so So what they found too was that as the severity of the symptoms increased, the diversity of the types reduced. And this finding may support the theory of personologic diathesis, which states that there are personality-based predispositions for stress, which is something that I will look into before making that video. I think it would be very interesting to look into that theory. Another thing that they found was when ES or IS is paired with J, frequency of symptoms is increased. And when ES or IS is paired with P, frequency of symptoms decreased. So that is part of why they've concluded that judgers are more likely than perceivers to experience symptoms of stress. When extroverts were paired with intuitive and perceiving preferences, increased symptom frequency was noted, as with the ENFP and ENTP. And when introverts were paired with N and P preferences, symptoms showed higher frequency but less consistence. So that would be INFP and INTP. So that's interesting because what they're looking at is the interaction between cognitive functions or personality preferences, not necessarily cognitive functions because we're not going into the cognitive stack right now, but when when different preferences interact, it can change their likelihood of having these symptoms. Also found that when EN or IN is paired with J, frequency of symptoms decreased, and when ES or IS is paired with P, frequency of symptoms increased, although less consistently. So it's sort of like the opposite, right? So EN and IN, if they're paired with P, have higher symptoms than if they're paired with J, whereas ES and IS, when paired with J, has less symptoms, and with P has more symptoms. Oh wait. Yeah, so actually with both, P increases. Yeah, sorry, I had to think for a second because I was totally wrong. It's not opposite. What they're finding is that P increases stress symptomology, but also increases positive coping, which is interesting. I think that might be the last of my highlights. Some other information that I found in the literature review that I would like to go back to is several studies into coronary heart disease patients, and they found that ISTJs are actually, in the studies, there's a variance of about 1.5 times and 3.5 times more likely to get coronary heart disease. So I'd really like to look into the physical health of types, which really does have a lot to do with stress symptomology. And what I would like to look into, and I'm not sure if there's research that's been done into this, is the effect of socioeconomic status on personality type, the effect of attachment style on personality type, because if there's anything that I've learned from sociology, is that all of these things play a part on health. So for example, in medical sociology, we found out that poor people are more likely than rich people to die young, to have debilitating illnesses, to have poor health, even in countries where they have access to healthcare, when there is when they're poor because of their living conditions, because of all of that. And so when you look at something like CHD, I think it would be interesting to know what the socioeconomic factors are, what the living conditions are, what the relationships that different types have to people, and if those correlate. And I'm not sure that I'm going to have that information. And if I don't have that information, then I will not report on that information. I just think it's super, super interesting. So I will link the study that I referenced below if I can. I'm not sure if people will be able to have access to it outside of the UH system, but I will put it in APA reference format, and then if I can find a link outside of the UH system, then I will attach that. And big thanks to Dana Grisby for her work. She did a great job. This thing's like 70-something pages. I have not read all of it, but I intend to. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed my rambles. I think that this has helped me sort of pare down what I want to mention in my research proposal, which was the intent of this. And if it helped anyone or was interesting to anyone, that's awesome. Please comment and interact with me. I'm an ENFP, so I love the social interaction, and I would love to get your perspectives on it and any research that y'all have done that I could look into as well. Bye.